In November 2017, a middle-aged man sat under bright production lights in Miami, telling a documentary crew about the empire he'd helped build. He described the stash houses, the fleets of 18-wheelers, the $50 million a month in merchandise flowing through his hands before he was old enough to legally buy a drink. For hours, he reconstructed the architecture of a $2 billion trafficking syndicate with the fluency of someone who had never really left it. He hadn't. Within days of that interview, Pedro Peggy Rosello attempted to broker the sale of 5 kilograms to a man he believed was a buyer. The man was a DEA informant. The logistics prodigy who had once moved 800 kilos past federal surveillance without breaking a sweat was arrested in a standard low-level sting, the kind reserved for corner dealers and desperate middlemen. He was 52 years old. He'd been free for over 2 decades. And sitting in front of those cameras hadn't been an interview. It had been a relapse. His father came home exhausted every night. Long hours, modest wages, the kind of work that wore a man down without ever lifting him up. Pedro Rosello grew up watching this in Little Havana during the late 1970s, and he internalized it the way only a child can, not as a lesson in dignity or perseverance, but as a warning. To him, his father's life wasn't a foundation. It was a trap. When asked later about his childhood ambitions, Rosello didn't offer the standard answers. He never wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer or a fireman. He wanted to be a drug dealer. Not because he understood what that meant. No child does. But because in the Miami of his youth, the drug dealers were the only men on his block who didn't look tired. They drove cars that gleamed. They wore watches that caught the light. They moved through the neighborhood with an ease that suggested the rules everyone else followed simply didn't apply to them. For a boy who had already decided that his father's path led nowhere, these men represented the only visible alternative. The bridge between aspiration and opportunity came through his sister. Gina Rosello began dating and eventually married Gustavo Taby Falcon, the brother of Augusto Willie Falcon. Willie, along with his lifelong friend Salvador Sal Magluta, was in the early stages of building an organization that would eventually be recognized by federal authorities as the most prolific trafficking syndicate on the east coast of the United States. The group called itself Los Muchachos. It would ultimately be responsible for importing an estimated 75 to 175 tons of product into the country, generating revenues that the government would later estimate at $2.1 billion. Rosello didn't fight his way into this world. He was absorbed into it through the permeable membrane of family. At 14, his involvement began with the most mundane task imaginable: washing cars. He detailed the luxury vehicles of Taby Falcon and his associates, a teenager with a rag and a bucket, standing in the driveways of men who controlled more capital than most regional banks. But proximity to power is its own education. He learned the rhythms of the operation, who arrived when, who deferred to whom, how money moved, and where it went. By 15, they had him counting cash and keeping books, his adolescent brain being formatted not for school or college applications, but for the precise management of enormous risk and enormous reward. His first real transaction came through a childhood friend named Mandy, whose mother had worked alongside Rosello's mother. Mandy recognized what everyone in Little Havana already knew, that Rosello's brother-in-law was connected to the most powerful organization in South Florida, and leveraged that connection for a deal. It was a small step, but it was the step that changed the trajectory permanently. From that point forward, Rosello was no longer the kid who washed the cars. He was an operator. The moment that elevated Rosello from peripheral family associate to indispensable organizational asset arrived in 1987, when a key lieutenant known within the syndicate as Jay was suddenly incarcerated. Jay's arrest created a vacuum at the most sensitive level of the operation, the management of the stash houses. These were the nerve centers of the entire enterprise, the physical locations where bulk product was received, broken down, repackaged, and where the resulting ocean of street cash was consolidated and stored. Managing them required absolute trustworthiness, meticulous record-keeping, and the temperament to handle enormous pressure without attracting attention. Rosello was barely out of his teens. They gave him the job anyway. What set him apart was not aggression or intimidation, but a quality far rarer in the trade: precision. He ran the stash houses the way a forensic accountant runs an audit. Every kilo accounted for, every dollar reconciled. In an industry defined by skimming, product loss, and internal theft, Rosello's operations ran clean. He would later say with evident pride that under his management, nothing was ever missing. When associates failed to meet his standards, he removed them, not through violence, but through termination, the way a regional manager fires an underperforming employee. He treated the most dangerous supply chain in the Western Hemisphere like a franchise operation. His responsibilities expanded rapidly. He began intercepting maritime and aerial shipments at drop points in Homestead, Florida, loads of 2,000 to 2,500 kilograms at a time. He coordinated the movement of product into hidden stash houses across South Florida and managed its distribution to wholesale buyers. Alongside Tabby Falcon, he helped establish the syndicate's westward expansion, setting up operations in Los Angeles and overseeing the 18-wheeler fleets that carried thousands of kilos across the interstate system. Sal Magluta, the more disciplined of the two bosses, took a particular interest in the young operator's development. Magluta drilled into him the imperative of staying low-key, of never drawing the kind of attention that triggered federal investigations. When Rosello, flush with new money and adolescent ego, purchased a flashy Lotus sports car, his mentor Jay forced him to return it to the dealership the same week. The car was too loud, too conspicuous, too likely to generate the kind of law enforcement interest that could compromise the entire family. Rosello brought it back. The lesson stuck. By 19, he was managing up to 5,000 kilograms a month and overseeing stash houses that held upwards of $50 million in physical currency at any given time. He was no longer the kid brother-in-law. He was the operational backbone of one of the most lucrative criminal enterprises in American history, and he had gotten there without ever firing a weapon or winning a territorial dispute. He had gotten there by being reliable. At its zenith in the late 1980s, the Falcon Magluta organization operated with a scale and audacity that made it functionally indistinguishable from a Fortune 500 company, except that its product was illegal and its revenue was untaxable. The $2.1 billion in estimated gross revenue dwarfed most legitimate Miami industries. The Federal Reserve's Miami branch reported a currency surplus of $5 billion during this period, money that no legitimate economic activity could account for. A significant share of that surplus flowed through the hands of Los Muchachos. Rosello sat at the center of this financial hurricane, and it changed him in ways he would later describe with unsettling clarity. He called his mental state during this period detached from reality. The sheer volume of money he handled daily, the shrink-wrapped bricks of cash stacked in closets, the stash houses that looked like suburban homes from the outside and bank vaults from the inside, eroded his capacity to assess risk like a normal human being. He described transporting 800 kilograms directly past police officers who were surveilling his residence, feeling nothing. Not fear, not adrenaline, nothing. He was 20 years old and already convinced that consequences were something that happened to other people. The lifestyle matched the psychology. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, $30,000 nights at Miami's most exclusive clubs. But the most revealing detail of Rosello's peak came not from a nightclub or a showroom, but from his mother's hands. While cleaning his bedroom, her teenage son's bedroom, she opened a closet and found a cardboard box. It contained $8 million in banded cash. She fainted on the spot. The image captures everything about the surreal duality of Rosello's existence. A working-class Cuban mother doing laundry, collapsing at the sight of a fortune that her son had accumulated before he was old enough to vote. Rosello's primary residence during this era was a fifth-floor unit at the Champlain Towers South Condominium in Surfside, Florida, the same building that would tragically collapse decades later, killing 98 people. In the 1980s, It served a very different function. In Rosello's own words, it was a hub for kingpins, a luxury fortress deliberately located away from the heavy undercover police presence concentrated on South Beach. Early units were purchased through anonymous shell companies registered in Panama and the Netherlands Antilles, all cash transactions that bore every hallmark of industrial-scale money laundering. It was in this apartment that Rosello brought Alexia Echeverria after meeting her at a high-end Miami restaurant in the late 1980s. Their courtship involved a brief love triangle with baseball star Jose Canseco. Rosello won. He brought Alexia back to the 5th floor, and in the middle of the night, a call came in, the kind that didn't wait. A shipment had arrived and needed immediate coordination. He left her alone in the apartment without explanation and disappeared into the operational machinery of the cartel. She had no idea what he did for a living. She assumed his wealth came from legitimate business. A beautiful woman alone in a luxury condo while her date orchestrated the movement of multi-ton loads through South Florida. The entire absurdity of Rosello's dual existence condensed into a single evening. Yet beneath the excess, his operational discipline never fully disappeared. He restricted all distribution activity to Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, an artificial constraint that minimized his physical exposure and reduced the windows during which law enforcement could observe movement. He viewed the business as purely transactional and actively despised violence, not on moral grounds, but on financial ones. The profit margins were so vast that a $150,000 loss on a compromised deal was a rounding error. Retaliating over that kind of money only generated police attention, which cost far more than the loss itself. It was the logic of a businessman, not a gangster. And it was precisely that logic that blinded him. He didn't believe he was untouchable because he was powerful. He believed he was untouchable because he was precise. He had confused operational excellence with invulnerability. Rosello's fatal flaw was not greed. He had more money than he could spend, and by his own admission, the cash eventually became almost meaningless. Stacks of paper that accumulated faster than he could count them, let alone enjoy them. His flaw was subtler, more deeply wired, and ultimately more destructive. He was addicted to the game itself. Because he was integrated into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise before his brain had finished developing, the extreme neurological stimulation of high-stakes logistics became his permanent baseline. The adrenaline of intercepting a 2,000-kilo shipment at a drop point in Homestead. The satisfaction of a perfectly reconciled stash house. The quiet power of knowing that an entire distribution network moved on his schedule, his discipline, his word. These experiences didn't just shape his adolescence, they colonized it. By the time he was old enough to consider alternatives, there were no alternatives. The machine had already been wired into his nervous system. This flaw would not become visible during the Empire years. It didn't need to be. The environment sustained it perfectly. The flaw only revealed itself later, in the agonizing decades when Rosello tried to live as a civilian, when the daily reality of a legitimate paycheck and an office desk collided with a nervous system calibrated for the highest stakes logistics operation in the Western Hemisphere. He would later reflect on it with a grim metaphor. Animals placed in a cage eventually die, but humans adapt. They learn to function. But the adaptation is a performance, not a transformation. The cage is still a cage, and the moment the door opens, even slightly, the original wiring takes over. On September 17, 1991, federal agents arrived at Rosello's driveway as part of a massive, coordinated takedown of Los Muchachos, the empire that had generated $2.1 billion and moved product measured in tons, collapsed in a single morning of arrest warrants and handcuffs. Rosello was 26 years old. He was facing a 24-year federal sentence. What happened next defies every convention of underworld loyalty. While in custody, U.S. Marshals informed Rosello that Willie Falcon and Sal Magluta wanted to speak with him. The two men who had built the empire, the surrogate fathers who had raised him inside the machine since he was 14. delivered a message that no one in law enforcement expected. They told him to cooperate. They told him to testify against them. They told him to save himself. Their only condition was simple: don't lie. The men who had every reason to demand his silence instead ordered his betrayal. They considered him the baby of the combo, the youngest member of the inner circle, the one who had been pulled in before he was old enough to understand the full weight of the choice, and they chose to let him go. In the history of organized crime, this kind of sanctioned cooperation is almost unheard of. Whether it was genuine paternal sacrifice or a calculated move to control the narrative of cooperation is something only Falcon and Magluta truly know. But for Rosello, it provided something invaluable: absolution. He could testify without carrying the full psychological burden of betrayal, because the men he was betraying had given him permission. Empowered by their blessing, Rosello became a devastating cooperator. He provided federal agents with a hand-drawn map of a fortified estate on Lagort's Island, directly facilitating the tactical arrest of Sal Magluta. He subsequently became a central witness in the landmark 1996 trial, taking the stand to meticulously reconstruct the syndicate's logistics: the stash houses, the 18-wheelers, the drop points, the cash management systems he had personally overseen. Defense attorneys Roy Black and Albert Krieger savaged his credibility, calling him a sleazy prisoner informant willing to fabricate anything to reduce his sentence. The prosecution countered by emphasizing the obvious: his sister was married to Willie's brother. He hadn't infiltrated the organization. He had grown up inside it. Falcon and Magluta were acquitted in that 1996 trial. An outcome later revealed to be the result of a $500,000 cash bribe paid directly to the jury foreman, Miguel Moya. But Rosello's cooperation had already earned its reward. His 24-year sentence was slashed. He served 4.5 years. He walked out of federal prison before he turned 31. He had been given the rarest thing the criminal justice system offers: a second life. He couldn't hold on to it. His marriage to Alexia Echevarria ended in divorce shortly after his release. She retained custody of their 2 sons, Peter Jr. and Frankie, and built a public career that would eventually lead to the Real Housewives of Miami. But she didn't abandon Rosello entirely. When she married Herman Echevarria, a successful Miami businessman, advertising agency owner, and former Hialeah City Council president, she insisted that Rosello be treated as a package deal with her children. Herman, in an act of extraordinary generosity, agreed. He gave his wife's ex-husband an executive position at his advertising firm, paying him $4,000 to $5,000 a month for roughly a decade. Rosello knew nothing about advertising. He said so freely. The job was a charitable fiction, a salary in exchange for showing up, a legitimate identity grafted onto a man who had spent his formative years managing cartel logistics. But it worked. For nearly 20 years, Rosello held the structure together. He went to the office, he attended the parties, he collected his paycheck. From the outside, it looked like rehabilitation. From the inside, it was a slow suffocation. The problem was not the money. $5,000 a month was comfortable. The problem was that Rosello's nervous system had been calibrated in his adolescence for a level of operational intensity that no advertising agency could replicate. He sat in air-conditioned conference rooms and felt nothing. He attended VIP events through his association with Venue magazine and felt the proximity of the old world, the clubs, the money, the ambient presence of the drug trade in Miami's elite social ecosystem, pulling at him like gravity. He began sourcing small quantities for personal use, reconnecting with old contacts not for profit, but for the transactional thrill, the handshake, the exchange, the brief electric proximity to the life that had made him feel competent, alive, and real. Then the structural supports began to fail. In 2007, the erosion of his discipline became impossible to ignore. Rosello was arrested on charges involving a minor, not a peripheral lapse, but evidence that the self-control he'd once wielded as his defining trait was degrading across every dimension of his life. not just the ones connected to the drug trade. The charge resulted in 12 years of probation. He violated it within 5 years. The man who had once run the tightest logistics operation in the American drug trade was now incapable of meeting the most basic terms of his own supervised release. Herman Echevarria died suddenly of a heart attack in 2016, removing the last professional and financial anchor from Rosello's life. His youngest son, Frankie, had already suffered permanent brain damage in a catastrophic 2011 car accident, spending 3 months in a medically induced coma. His older son, Peter, was arrested in 2012 for battery. The wreckage of the empire years had seeped into the next generation, damaging people who had never chosen the life that produced them. And then came the documentary. In November 2017, Rosello sat down with filmmaker Billy Corben for what would become part of the Netflix series Cocaine Cowboys, The Kings of Miami. For hours, he inhabited his former self, the teenage prodigy, the logistics king, the man who moved $50 million a month and felt nothing but invincibility. The interview activated something that 2 decades of quiet civilian life had only suppressed, never extinguished. Almost immediately afterward, Rosello attempted to broker the sale of 5 kilos. The buyer was an undercover informant, the man who had once orchestrated the cross-country movement of thousands of kilos in 18-wheeler fleets, was handcuffed in a standard sting operation. 5 kilos. For a man who had routinely managed shipments measured in tons, it was the equivalent of a retired CEO being arrested for shoplifting. He was sentenced to federal prison and eventually released in February 2022. The men who had built Rosello into what he became met their own ends. Sal Magluta was eventually convicted and is currently serving 195 years in a federal supermax facility. Willie Falcon accepted a plea deal, served 20 years, and was deported to the Dominican Republic upon release. And Gustavo Tabi Falcon, the brother-in-law whose cars Rosello had washed as a 14-year-old, chose the opposite path. He refused to cooperate. He ran. For 26 years, he lived under an assumed identity until U.S. Marshals finally found him in April 2017, riding a bicycle on a quiet street in Kissimmee, Florida. Rosello cooperated and couldn't escape the life. Tabi ran and couldn't escape the law. Neither path led to freedom. Today, Pedro Peggy Rosello works in his family's air conditioning business, driving a company van through the streets of the same city where he once commanded a distribution network worth more than most publicly traded companies. He is, by every external measure, a free man living a modest, legitimate life. But the permanent psychological imprint of the machine reveals itself in a single, involuntary habit. While driving that van, to a service call, to a supply run, to anywhere, he compulsively checks his rearview mirror over and over, scanning for federal surveillance vehicles that are no longer there. The part of his brain that was formatted at 14, the part that learned to count cartel money before it learned to file a tax return, never received the update that the game was over. It's still running the old program. It always will be. Rosello's story is not ultimately about drugs, or money, or even betrayal. It's about what happens when you hand a 14-year-old the keys to a billion-dollar empire and then expect him, decades later, to be satisfied with a normal life. The machine didn't just employ him, it raised him. It colonized the neural architecture of his adolescence, wrote the code for what excitement felt like, what competence felt like, what being alive felt like. And no amount of time, not 4 years in federal prison, not 20 years in an advertising office, not the love of his children or the generosity of a man who owed him nothing, could overwrite that code. So the question is this: was he doomed the moment they handed a 14-year-old the keys to a stash house, or did he have a real chance and simply choose not to take it? Drop your answer in the comments.